Dr. Gloria Lattimore Peace, host and producer of OmniU presents the H3O Art of Life show. I am here in the brand new facilities of CAN TV. It's been about a year since I've enjoyed sitting on a stage with a guest, and it's been a long time since I've been here in the studio with this particular guest, whom I love and adore. And his name is Hunter Haviland Adams III. And I'd just like to say hello to him before I say a little bit more.
Oh, hello. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm great.
And you're fresh back from your presentation of something related to the book that you are writing, and I hope very near finishing, so that I'm anxious to read it. And the thing about your book, because you've allowed me, and I thank you for the privilege, you've allowed me to have a look at it and to make some comments about its contents. And it's the kind of thing, it's almost like reading a mystery. You just want to get to the end. You know, you want to see how it's all going to wind up. But of course, in order to see how it's all going to wind up, you do need to read the story. You need to go through the story. So I've titled this show, Slave from the Label to the Fable. In other words, I'm saying first you have to come up with a concept, and then you build the story. So I want you to take us through that in whatever order you want to. If you want to start with the fable or start with the label or somewhere in between, be my guest, because I am here to hear a repeat of a presentation that I was not privileged to see.
Oh, thank you very much for that generous introduction and very kind words. I did a presentation last night, September 28th, for a friend's psychology class, psychology from an African-centered perspective, that is, more specifically, for a local university. I won't call their name. And the whole point was to give the professor, as well as the students, a perspective that's been missing with all the discussions around slavery, with discussions around the recently released United Nations Working Group for people of African descent report. Really, I advise everyone to go on the UN website, Human Rights section, and look for the working group, People of African Descent, who were here in January of 2016 interviewing African American citizens about their experiences currently and historically in this country. And the report really sets up a framework which the Washington Post calls a history of racial terrorism, quoting a comment made in the report. So if you want to have any idea of the totality of what's been happening to African people, at least since 1619, during the settler colony period, right up to the present day, it'll be worth your while to review this report of the United Nations Working Group for People of African Descent, because it really gives people broad context to the shootings and killing, executions, in fact, in my opinion, of at least some of them, of African American men, the strange deaths in custody of African American women, the beatdown of African American children in classes, early suspensions of preschool African American children, all of that. The miseducation that Dr. Carter G. Woodson talked about a century ago now, almost. And so all of that, everything, that Du Bois talked about, the double consciousness, but it's the double consciousness is not just for Negroes, as he said at that time, but it's for people who call themselves white as well, because they have a double consciousness too. You know, they're in deep denial of what has been happening for centuries, you know, in deep denial on how the First Nations people were pushed off their land and relegated to an enclosed status, you know, which, you know, people call reservations, but they're really prisoners. They're not sovereign nations. So this UN report, I strongly urge your viewers to get it, study it, share it with your organizations, download it. They make a number of incredible recommendations as to what can be done. You know, they provide a toolkit with examples for things that people can do and not just wait around for Congress or state legislatures or municipalities, aldermen and mayors to do something. So it's something that we all should be involved in. And so that was the context for this presentation last night, you know, but Dr. Gloria, you know, you well know that I've been working on this project for around 7 years. And sometimes life just pulls you into something that you had no intention on ever really doing. I had no intention on engaging in a process, a project on slavery. I was more concerned with how do our brains and minds work. I've done presentations a number of places on that recently at the University of Stockholm in Sweden, you know, and I'm concerned about African philosophy. But I wasn't interested in slavery. But you know one thing, I recalled an experience that I had as a child in Sunday school at Salem Lutheran Church on 78th and Calumet Avenue. And at that time in the late 50s, early 60s, Salem was populated primarily with Swedish, as the pastor was, and German immigrants, and a smattering of African Americans who were moving into the Park Manor, Chatham neighborhood. But it was an overwhelmingly, quote, white congregation, you know, that our people were integrating in. And for the most part, you know, they were not hostile. You know, in fact, they were welcoming their new neighbors, their new fellow worshipers. And, you know, but as a child, you know, I didn't understand all of that. I just liked the organ music, even though, you know, they were playing, you know, particularly at the end of the service, the organist was playing classical European orchestrations and stuff. But because it was a huge pipe organ and it filled the entire sanctuary with this, you know, voluminous sound, it was something to hear, you know. So that's what attracted me and my family there. But, you know, one Sunday school, spring Sunday school afternoon, I never will forget. Our Sunday school teacher was Miss Esther Dixon, a really wonderful, beautiful woman, also black, but very fair. As I recall, there was a white boy in the class, and he pointed to me, "You people are just like those Hebrews in Egypt." And I was really offended and didn't really understand why. I was really offended and saddened by it, and Mrs. Dixon saw, you know, the sadness on my face, and she said, "It's all right. God loves you and I love you." And so after Sunday school, she said, "What I want you to do is to bring a picture of yourself, and then next Sunday, come to my house," which was, you know, really about a block and a half away. "And I'm going to take your picture and place it in my Bible." And what she did. And, I said, I just didn't identify with slaves. I didn't think my parents weren't slaves, their parents weren't slaves, great-grandparents weren't slaves. I just never agreed to that label.
If I interrupt you, will you be able to keep your train
Sure.
of thought? Because right there is something that continues to trouble me. And that is this myth that there were Hebrews in Egypt that were in fact enslaved by the Egyptians, which I am taught by Jacob H. Carruthers and Joseph Ben Levi and others, is not the case. That we were not holding, or our ancient ancestors were not holding Hebrews in bondage in Egypt. So I know that this is also a part of your scholarship, and I'd like you to just speak on that and then go back to your train of thought.
Absolutely. And that's part of the fable, the slavery fable. Dr. Joseph Ben Levi, I think he's one of the most brilliant scholars I know, particularly in history and linguistics. Here's a man who speaks and reads fluently a host of European languages, including Greek and Latin, of African languages, in particular Medu Neter, or the language of Kemet. And he's one, and Hebrew, by the way, and Akkadian, we can go on, and Hieratic. He's a brilliant guy. And so he would say, he said, well, Hunter, he said, there's no Hebrew or Kemetic word for slave. And he would point out that the Hebrew word that's been mistranslated as slave, ebed, E-B-E-D, or abed, means servant. And the servant is servant of God, servant of Yahweh, servant of the king, servant of your mother and father, not slave of your mother and father. That makes no sense. They didn't have a sense of ownership of the body of a person. The Hebrews did, and neither did the Kemetic people. Now, you probably heard me say Kemetic. Egypt is an invention. Egypt is a mistranslation that, I don't have time to really go into it, but it's a mistranslation from Egyptos to Heka Ptah, or the house of the Neter Ptah, not God, because they didn't have the idea of the Western notion of God, because African people, those in Kemet, the Nile Valley, understood everything was divine. The cosmos was divine. The stars were divine. People, plants, alligators, bugs, the Scarabeus beetle that rolls a ball of cow dung, rolls cow dung into a ball and lays the eggs in it, was a symbol for the constant regeneration of the earth and of people and of life. So they didn't have this limited understanding of the German word Gott, that now is God, that we all have. They were very clear on that. And so it was only during the Ptolemaic era, or the era when Alexander, the so-called Great, from Macedonia, conquered Egypt, tricked them when they were pushing out the Persians around 330 or so BC. That's when the name changed, and then it stuck. And so there was no Egypt. That's a recent invention. That's a label. And so when we want to talk about, quote, the pharaohs or the kings and queens, we have to say Kemet and not Egypt. because the Arabs can't lay claim to that legacy. Europeans, although they've tried, can't lay claim to that legacy. Martin Bernal, you know, in his 3 volumes, Black Athena, tried to tell people, and he was rigorously, vigorously put down, beat down for violating the law of European historiography by claiming that this was false. And so, I'm sorry, there were no Slavic people in ancient Israel or Kemet. You heard me, Slavic people from which the word slave is derived. And so let me explain to you how I really got confirmation of that.
Go ahead.
Okay, and that happened with an incredible experience I had at the behest of a dear friend, Dr. Patricia Newton, who's a psychiatrist based in Baltimore. But she's also an international meeting planner, right? And Chicago follows a tradition established by its founder, Jean-Baptiste du Sable, of an area for trade, for shows, where people come from all over to trade and do deals, real deals. And so every year, there's a show called the Motivation Show. And the Motivation Show is an incentive travel show. And it takes up the entirety of McCormick Place. Imagine that. 250,000 square feet, you know, thousands of exhibitors and people. People from 60 countries come, marketers come. You know, how can we find the latest things to motivate our employees to be better than they were before? How can we develop incentives for people to come to visit our particular countries and stay in particular hotel properties? So all these people converge right here at McCormick Place. And so, you know, a few years, she asked me, she said, well, and another friend, an attorney friend of ours, hey, y'all want to come to the Motivation Show? You got to come down and see how this is. And so she got us registered as guests, and we went, and it was incredible to see. But the most significant thing were the after sets, the receptions that countries would hold. And these were invitation only, just anybody couldn't walk up in there. And so there was one reception that we went to that had the air of a state dinner, like a real state dinner. And that was the Czech Republic reception held at the beautiful Spertus Institute of Judaic Studies and Leadership on North Michigan Avenue in a room called Venue 10-6 Grand Hall, an incredibly beautiful space for holding events, because out the windows you could see the lakefront, Millennium Park, Navy Pier, you know, the Art Institute. Beautiful, beautiful space, very spirited place as well. And so the Consulate General of the Czech Republic of Chicago, Marek Solkil, I hope I'm pronouncing his name correct, was the host. And he spoke and talked about, you know, they had, you know, lots of food, you know, wine, everything was fantastic. And he spoke about how Prague is a sister city to Chicago. Chicago has an international sister cities program. Accra, Ghana, is another sister city. And so after he spoke, I went up to him and greeted him, and my friends were watching me. And we had, you know, just some light conversation. And I told him I was enthusiastic about your president, your philosopher, poet, and playwright president, Václav Havel. And he looked at me, he said, "You know about him?" I said, "Yeah." Now the "you" was me as a black guy know about Czech history, about him. Yes, I said, "Yeah, you know, I really admired his efforts in the Velvet Revolution, the overturning of the old Soviet communist empire throughout Eastern Europe." And he looked at me, he said, "Well, do you know Queen Latifah?" And so I smiled. I said, "Yeah, I know her." "Well, do you know that her movie Last Holiday was filmed at the Grand Hotel Pup in Karlovy, right outside of Prague?" I said, "No, I didn't know that." He said, "Well, then you must come to Prague and have your next meeting there. I assure you, you'll have a wonderful time." I said, okay. I said, "Sir, I have a question I would like to ask you, if you don't mind." I said, "It's a burning question, one that's been eating at me for a long time." And he said, "Okay, what is it?" I said, "Can you explain to me how did the ethnonym or designation for a linguistic and Eastern European people, Slav, become the brand slave?" And he looked at me, agitated, "Dr. Peace, we don't talk about that." And I said, "Oh." So I put on my journalist hat and I came at him another way and asked him the question again. He said, "We don't talk about that." He said, "But I tell you what I'll do. I'm going to make you an offer. If you put your name on our email list, I will send you an invitation to a commemoration, 20-year commemoration of the Velvet Revolution. And there will be a Slavic history and language specialist there who I'm sure can answer your question." So I said, fine. And I thanked them, and I put my name on their email list. Every week I'm getting invitations to things happening at the Chicago Czech Consulate on North Michigan Avenue, till finally in April of 2010, I got that invitation, to their event. And so I go down there, take the elevator to the 16th floor, had to surrender my driver's license, because of security reasons. You're actually entering in another country, even though it's a consulate. And so I get off, I walk down a corridor which was dimly lit, and I could see a film was being shown. And I enter the room, and everyone turned around and looked at me, wondering, who is he? Why is he here? Who invited him? But they weren't hostile, Dr. Peace. It was more curiosity. So then after another short film was shown, then they introduced the main speaker. And his name was Andrew Baruch, Wachel. And he was the dean at Northwestern University. He's written 16 books on Slavic history and language and, other things. I said, wow, this guy surely can tell me. He can answer my question. So I had high hopes that I was going to get my question answered. So after he finished, there was a crowd of people, like most things like this. And I did see the Consulate General, and I spoke to him and thanked him for inviting me. And he did remember me, by the way. And so then finally I had a chance to speak with Professor Wachel. And we had some light talk on science and linguistics. And then I asked him the same question. And immediately there was a sense of deja vu. And he said, we don't talk about that. And he abruptly turned his back on me and walked away. So I felt dissed and disappointed. But then something interesting happened. A guy standing next to me who was eavesdropping in on our conversation said, that's my dad. And we don't talk about that. We commemorate it with food and drink. Come with me to the conference room and let's celebrate, commemorate with a traditional Czech dinner and Czech beer. I said, okay, and we'll have some conversation. This is his son. Watch your son. I don't remember his first name. And so I go into the conference room and I see this huge table. It was a huge room, this long table. And the table had 2 big serving pots of something. I didn't know what it was. And then there were trays with like potato dumplings and fruit dumplings and something that looked like fried chicken tenders and cheese and crackers and breads and stuff. So as we got closer to the table where the pots, the serving bowls, huge serving bowls were, you know, the odor was pungent and very unpalatable. And so I asked him, what is this? And he said, oh, that's goulash Czech style. I'll mispronounce the actual name, but it's, you know, we have a pork feast. And in here is all parts of the pig, everything that a butcher would do. And this is a tradition carried on from the period known as the darkness, or the Temno, Temno, the darkness. I said, what? What is the darkness? And then he told me that was a period from roughly the 16th century to the beginning of the 18th century when the Germans and the Austrians overran Slavic communities, particularly Czechs, took control over their land. And then there was Arab and Mongol and Ottoman Turk invasions, and they captured Czech women and trafficked them for sex, and you know, men were murdered. It was just a terrible thing. He's explaining this to me. I said, oh, sounds familiar to me. And then he went on and said, well, let me serve you something. I said, well, no, I'm vegetarian. I'm sorry. And so then he began, Dr. Peace, to give me a history of this language, of Slav, and where it came from, of where the people originated. There were no Slavic people prior to around 500 AD as a group identified with that name. They didn't exist. And the word slave didn't exist until around 1290 AD. The word slave, from the French esclave, and also from Greek. So that word slave is a recent term. Now think about this. When people read the scriptures and they see slave inserted in it, right? Instead of servants obey your masters, they say slaves obey your masters. That's a mistranslation, a political mistranslation, because the term did not exist. There were no Slavs in Palestine. There were no Slavs in Palestine. So how can you use a word that's derived from Slavic people and make the claim that Slavs existed? So we've been victim to, that's part of the fable, we've been victim to gross political mistranslations of the scriptures. And so, you know, he just goes on and he said, well, you know, I said, what about this enslaved? He said, well, you know, it's very easy. Enslaved comes from the Latin word clavis, which means enclose. And for Slavs, they were enclosed in their own land by other people. So they were prisoners of war in their own land. So enslave means enclose or prisoners of war. It does not mean the same that people who are trying to change the name from slave to enslave, that something was done to them, because the humiliation doesn't go away. You can say enslave, but the humiliation doesn't go away. And so he continued with the story, giving me more details on the evolution of language. And he said, and then he concluded, we didn't quite conclude, but he said, think about this, Mr. Adams. Why would we want to use a term to self-humiliate ourselves in our own language, talking about us as a people? Why would we want to pass on a legacy of self-loathing to our grandchildren and their grandchildren by saying we are worthless, pitiless, and rightless? That makes no sense, and we didn't do that. This is what someone else put on us. I said, well, Mr. Watson, you know what's happened is that this bogus brand slave, even though it originated with Slavic people, when people hear the word slave, they don't think of Slavic people. They don't think of Eastern Europeans. They don't think of Europeans at all because they don't know that history. What they think about, what comes to mind immediately, is African people for the last 500 years. So much so that the Nigerian musician Fela Kuti wrote a song about it. Sorrow, Tears, and Blood is now our regular trademark, right? That's the trademark, the brand for African people, is this slave. And it's terrible. Think about this, Dr. Peace. When the First Lady of the United States said at the Democratic National Convention in July of this year, she said, I can look out my window and know that slaves built the White House. See my daughters playing on the lawn with their dogs. Think about this, Dr. Peace. Think about this. Slaves built the White House and Capitol. What is a slave? Is a slave a person? Does a slave have a history? Does a slave have a culture? Does a slave have desires for a future?
Does a slave have a language?
Right.
Does a slave have a land? Does a slave have a kinship group?
Does a slave have a birth certificate? Now remember, when the Republican Party presidential candidate started the birther controversy with President Obama saying he didn't have a birth certificate, remember, the births of African descendants in this country weren't always recorded. Many did not have a birth certificate because the Southerners wanted to keep the populations down so they would end up paying less taxes. That's an affront to us. And so we must dispense of this word slave. The people were prisoners of war. They were sequestered. They weren't like the Germans who were captured during the war and put in so-called concentration camps, I would say confinement camps, but then they were freed. Some went back home, some went to South America, some became US citizens, Nazis. And we're seeing elements of that today in police departments. Nobody wants to talk about that. So we must dispense of this word slave totally, completely. Never, ever refer to any person, even a woman being, quote, trafficked for sex. She's not a sex slave. She's not a commodity. A crime is being committed.
One other way that was used to keep the populations down so that the taxes would be lower was to define African people as 3/5 of a man.
Right.
So you're subhuman.
Right, you're a sub-person.
You can't be a full 100% person if you only have framed. 3/5.
Right, that's the framing. So see, we have been framed. We've been made guilty and we've committed no crime other than, in some people's eyes, existing. The crime is that you exist. But we're the ones who made America fly. So when you get on a plane today and travel anywhere, remember, it's our African labor that made that plane fly, metaphorically. It's the land of the First Nation peoples that established a place for America to fly. And so there's a reckoning taking place that many people around the world now, the Oxford Must Fall movement is happening. Historians are saying that we just can't continue to be in denial about this history. It's time to come clean. Painful it might be. You know, people will go into deeper denial, some will, but others say that we can't move forward as a people, that there's something known as humanity deficit disorder. Reviling others is reviling yourself. Right? There was a PBS program on African culture, you know, maybe 15 years ago, and they interviewed a Dinka from Sudan scholar, and the conversation shifted to divorce. It was all about human relationships, and he said, we don't believe in divorce. And the interviewer said, why? He said, because divorce is not possible. He said, why? He said, because you cannot divorce the presence of your beloved or former beloved from within you. That person is still part of you. So you have to harmonize that person within yourself. And there's, neuroscience research that affirms that. Mirror neuron research affirms that whole idea that we have within ourselves models of other people that we interact with. And so we got to harmonize within ourselves the other. That's part of us. You know, that's part of the human struggle. So reviling, calling people names, bullying, and all of that, it's affecting them. They may not see it or understand it or believe it, but neurologically it is. So when we say the word slave, think of all the S words that begin with SLA. You know, there's a field of cognitive linguistics, a subfield that deals with the sound of words. And in English, the sound slave cues up, brings into your awareness, but unconsciously so, subconsciously, similar words. That's why you hear rappers who freestyle. You know, they can rhyme at a minute, and it makes sense because they're playing on this semantic network of similar sounding words with similar meanings. So when you say slave, think slaughter. When you say slave, think slave. When you think slave, you think Slavish, and on and on. All of those words are queued up in your semantic network. Same way with the term white supremacy. Never ever use that term. Even though I know it's in parlance today, it's a disservice. Even though it's a political ideology, but some stupid people actually believe that they're supreme. And evidence suggests that they're not. And so instead of saying white supremacy, saying people of parasitic privilege. You know, they're parasites. They're preying on the lives, the creativity of other people to give them existence, to give them meaning. No more white supremacy, because every time you say white supremacy, it cues up black inferiority and everything negative about black. It's part of us. That's what we've learned and conditioned to. We can deny that, but there's been neuro-linguistic tests that reveals that. The implicit bias test by researchers at Harvard is an example of that. That we harbor implicit biases towards ourselves because after 300 years of socialization, we have that. So we think, oh, blacks are just crabs in a barrel, you know, pulling each other down. But that's not true.
But Hunter, that leads me to the portion of your book that talks about the 4 stories. I want to argue for 5, but I won't do it right here. But you talk about the 4 stories, and one of those stories is the story we tell ourselves about ourselves, and that is where you were when it came to mind. The other stories, the other 3 stories, the story
that we tell ourselves about others, and the stories that other people tell about themselves, all positive stories, stories that other people tell about their opponents or adversaries or competitors. We see that playing out in political campaigns where the candidates will frame themselves as the best thing since sliced bread and their opponent as a horrible person. But we have to frame our story first, that we are descendants of humans 2 million years ago, recently discovered in South Africa.
Humans.
Well, there was others, but these people, Homo naledi, N-A-L-D-E-D-I, Homo naledi, also the star people. Now, we don't have time to go into all of that on this show, but they, from evidence found of their fossilized bones in a cave, showed signs of modern human behavior. They had rituals and ceremonies for burying their dead, that women use iron ore, orchi, to paint themselves, to adorn themselves. They had fire. All of these things are modern things which are things which modern human beings have built upon over these past 2 million years.
Are they not referring to them as another species?
No, no, no. They said Homo.
So they,
human.
Okay, so they're
not.
They're the earliest humans.
They're the earliest one. Lucy, or I don't hate to say Lucy, but Dinquenish from Ethiopia around 4 million years ago was not considered within the human genus, human
Why
species.
was that not? Why not?
Well, you know, there's a whole lot of anthropological reasons. You know, one, you know, small stature and her brain size, and there's no corroborating evidence that's been found to support what cognitive paleoanthropologists would say is modern human behavior.
Oh, so now we define human. So now we decide to define human according to...
Well, it's debated, it's contested. And so, you know, we have to get our feet wet in that debate as well.
So therefore we can be 3/5 of a person.
No, we can't. That was a political label. Has no bearing anthropologically, biologically, or anything.
No one ever suggested that it had any credibility or any
believed
reason. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah,
it's not hard. It is not hard if once you have a category for non-humans. And
that's the value of having telling our own story and framing theirs. So I will frame theirs as false, It's a fable on a false label. And so we can do that. We can say this is what it is, and then let them contest us. I don't accept that, just like I don't accept slave. And we shouldn't either. We should not be content where the first lady of the United States or anyone of that stature, was probably not too many people of that stature, can say,
with that kind of influence.
Right, can say that slaves built the White House. No captive African people in the United States built the White House and the Capitol. They were captives. They were coerced in doing the work. They weren't doing the work freely of their own heart. They weren't being paid for doing the work. They didn't have a nice place to stay that Bill O'Reilly claimed, and food, 3 meals a day. They didn't have a happy meal. And we have to make that very clear so our children understand it. These students yesterday, some millennials, some older, they didn't understand that. They had never thought about that, like most of us. Thousands and thousands of books, articles, hundreds of films, and none of them go to the heart of what a slave is. There has not been one film that really looks at the word.
It begins with the acceptance.
That you accept this.
Right.
You accept this is how it is.
Right.
And
the assumption is that the category exists,
and
the
therefore
assumption is that the category refers to African people. And this is why I wanted to argue for the fifth story, because aside from the stories that they tell themselves about themselves, and they tell us about ourselves, and we tell ourselves about ourselves, and we tell ourselves about them, there's also the story of what they tell others about us. It's that press, it's that media, it's that stereotype that goes out before us. It would, maybe we could say, what makes it so bad is that fifth story, that the whole world,
the backstory, but then
the whole world is contaminated with that story.
Sure, absolutely.
And not only do we have to try to straighten out the story that we tell ourselves, but we now have to straighten out the story that's being told about us throughout the globe, everywhere. People come here never having seen us before, and come here already with a predetermined set of ideas about who we are and what our behavior it can be expected to be, and all of that. So that fifth story to me is equally important in the telling, in the unraveling of this fable, because I guess you have to do this simultaneously. You have to tear down the bastion of that fable while you erect the monument of our true identity. You've taken that on, Hunter, and I congratulate you for it. To say we were never slaves is going to cause a lot of debate, and it's not all going to be civil.
It's good. It's good. I mean, I learned that when I gave a similar presentation to the Black Psychiatrists of America last year, and an elder refused publicly. He stood up in the conference and said our people were slaves. Even after I made the argument, he says we were slaves.
He just cannot accept captive. He cannot accept people taken against their will from their kinship group, from their homeland, from their culture.
But
he couldn't accept captive, which is already, didn't have to invent a new word. It's already sitting there for you to utilize. Because if you're going to be precise, as Iyanla says, you got to call a thing a thing. And the thing is a captive and not a slave.
Right. I completely agree.
Well, then if you,
I couldn't argue with someone who is, 20 years my senior. I couldn't argue, but, we had a casual conversation afterwards. And he said, well, Dr. Adams, that's what he called me. He said, I really liked your presentation, but, we got to recognize that history of slavery, that we were put in this situation of slavery.
Well, I can tell you that when I was doing research during the time that I was teaching at the university, and that became a part of my interest and my obligation, I noticed that every scholar, every African scholar, every American-born African scholar, which would be African American, but I reject that as well. The point, though, that I want to make is that everyone took up the notion of the mental health of our people based upon the experience of having been held as captives and deprived of so much of who we are as a people. Every single, now you're a neuroscientist. I know that there's no argument here that we have been so affected by this captivity that we will undoubtedly have some among us who simply cannot change their minds because their minds remain, as Carter G. Woodson said, under the control of colonial forces. You know, he said, if you control a man's mind, you don't have to worry about his actions.
Right.
So the control of the minds of some of our people is evident in the fact that you can see that faced with all of the evidence to the contrary, they cling to ideas that have no validity, have no merit, but it is what they have been trained to do. It is what they have been trained to believe. It has been what they have been trained to rely on. And so you were right not to argue with your elder, because you cannot argue with someone whose mind is already closed, whose mind is already made up, and who you could amass evidence up to the heavens and they would still not be persuaded. So that is to be expected. Absolutely. And I'm sure that there are those of us who will be relieved to be returned to the human family after having been, set aside as always the descendants of slaves. And I love the fact that this put down, this having been called out of your name, had the effect that it finally did. It took many, many years. Many years, because you had to carry that weight. You had to carry that burden, as we all have to carry the burden. That's another one of those N words. Slave is not an S word. It's another N word. It's like, for me, it's like being called a minority, lower socioeconomic, culturally deprived,
that's why
culturally
we should never
disadvantaged.
refer to ourselves as poor people. We are not poor. Because when you say you're poor, you're conceding a state of being. We are disfavored by the oligarchs, the 1%, as many Europeans were during the darkness, as they talked about.
Someone else is holding our wealth in captivity.
We're disfavored.
Right.
We're not poor. When you're saying disfavored, it means someone does not hold you in favor.
Right.
That's different from saying poor. Oh, the poor will always be with us.
But our wealth is being held in captivity. That is why our people are arguing for reparations.
Right.
We do not possess our own wealth because it is not in our hands. It is in the hands of others. And
we have wealth. We have wealth in our relationships. We have wealth in our knowledge, but we're not utilizing that wealth, valuing that wealth to build our society.
I argued with someone, and I felt this strongly, when they said Dr. Burroughs came from humble beginnings. Dr. Burroughs was an African descendant who knew she was an African descendant.
Right.
How dare you place her in time in some little town where she was incarnated, when she is the descent, and she wrote, "And what shall I tell my children who are black?" She says, "I will take you into a way back time of kings and queens who ruled the Nile." She understood her ancestry.
Right.
She did not we do not come from humble
Martin Delaney.
beginnings. We are not poor people.
No, we're not.
The press has it all wrong, and you are writing the book that will set it right.
Well, it's my effort, small effort, and I hope that others will follow. I hope organizations will take up this message and use it to elevate the hearts and minds of their members. You know, now there's a movement called "What Should White People Do?" It's all over Facebook and Twitter. And, you know, there's a growing groups of white people all over the country and elsewhere who are asking, can you give us guidance and direction on how we need to move forward?
Well, I want to just see if I can get in this piece from your book where you say, "My premise is simple yet profound. There never, ever was a moment in time, in history, anywhere when African people were not human. Slave is a lifeless lie, a humanoid, sub-person, symbiotic simulation. No one is born a slave. Slavery is not our heritage. We were never 3/5 of a person. Slave is not our name." And the title of your book, "We Were Never Slaves," is dedicating to fleshing out, reframing this fable into real history. And I would leave the closing moments for you to summarize whatever you'd like to say.
Thank you very much for having me on your show. I really appreciate that this generosity of you giving me a chance to talk a little bit about this message. You know, the book has 6 sections. We've been framed from here, what was really experienced, what really happened, how do we get out of this mess, and may our hearts be in